It's amazing. Yeah, a lot of history.
And the way Jamshedpur could remain a Devi alive.
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this last session that Free Press Journal is having with I Am Indore. Not because we would not like more sessions of this kind, but because there are other things to be done as well. And we are delighted to have Mr. Narendran with us, who steers Tata Steel, which is a legend by itself. And before I go ahead with anything else, let me first give my thanks to 98.7 Big FM for being our outreach partner for this program. I will now pass on the session to Himanshu Rai, Director, I Am Indore, to introduce our chief speaker, and then he will speak, and then we'll engage him in a small conversation. Himanshu, over to you.
Very good evening to all our viewers. I hope all of you are staying safe and healthy along with your families. It's such a pleasure and a privilege for me to introduce to all of you Mr. TV Narendran. And this is a special privilege because I've had the good fortune of working in Tata Steel while he was there for 8.5 years.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Narendran is the CEO and Managing Director of Tata Steel Limited. As the CEO and MD, he has overseen the acquisition of Bhushan Steel Limited, now known as Tata Steel BSL Limited, and the steel business of Usha Martin Limited, now part of Tata Steel Long Products Limited. Earlier, as the Managing Director, he successfully executed Tata Steel's greenfield expansion at Kalinganagar. He has over 30 years of experience in the mining and metals industry. Mr. Narendran is currently on the board of Tata Steel Limited. He's also the chairman of Tata Steel Europe, Tata Steel BSL Limited, Tata Steel Long Products Limited, and the board of governors of XLRI Jamshedpur. He's a member on the board of the World Steel Association and is a member of the executive committee. He was a co-chair of the Mining and Metals Governors Council, the World Economic Forum from 2016-2018. And to top it all, he is the president designate of the Confederation of Indian Industry, CII, and is the vice president of the Indian Institute of Metals. Mr. Narendran is a mechanical engineer from the National Institute of Technology. I'm sure it was REC Trichy at that point of time, since I happen to be from REC Surathkal, and completed MBA from the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. He's a recipient of the Distinguished Alumnus Awards, both from NIT Trichy and Calcutta. He's a Chevening Scholar, has also attended the Advanced Management Program in CEDEP, CIAD, Fontainebleau, France. And now, before we start bombarding you, Bhaskar and I start bombarding you with questions, Naren, we would like to hear from you as to what do you think in general is going to be the steel sector beyond COVID-19? Over to you, Naren.
Thank you. Thank you, Himanshu. Thank you, Bhaskar, and privileged to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm going to spend a few minutes to describe the steel industry, to those of you who don't understand or are not familiar with the industry, because then you'll understand better what is the potential for this industry post-COVID and why it is important going forward. Steel is the most commonly used metal in the world. There's 40 times more steel used than the next commonly used metal, which is aluminum. Okay, not because it's the best metal around. It's a very versatile metal. It's very good value for money and finds applications in almost anything. So almost anything that you use is either made of steel or is made of a machine which uses steel. So steel is involved somewhere in your lives in many different ways. Globally, this industry was seen as a strategic industry, and traditionally governments had a stake in this industry for a long time, particularly between the world wars. But over a period of time, the ownership of this industry shifted from the public sector to the private sector, particularly in the West. And, the other thing which started happening in this industry is the center of gravity of the industry shifted from the developed countries to the developing countries, because steel is essential for the development of any country. It's very closely linked to the macroeconomic activity in a country. It's very important in construction. 60% of the steel in the world is used in construction. 20% of the steel used in the world is used in the automobile industry. 10 to 15% of the steel used in the world is used in the capital goods industry. So steel becomes a very important part of the development journey of any country. And hence the consumption of steel and the production of steel shifted from Europe and the Americas to Asia. And today, China accounts for 60%. It used to account for 50% of the steel consumption and production. Now it's about 60%. And the rest of Asia is another 20%. So about 80% of the steel today is consumed in Asia. Now, having said that, why is India such an important country in this play? You know, most countries either have raw materials or the markets. China has the markets, doesn't have much of iron ore. It imports a lot of the iron ore, which is what is most important in the production of steel. And most of the iron ore in the world lies in countries like Australia and Brazil or Russia, which don't have a big market. India is one of those countries which has the iron ore and the market. So when you look at a Make in India story, I don't think there's any industry better positioned to make in India than steel, because you have the raw materials, you have the markets, and you know, you make steel and you're acting as a bridge between the raw materials and the markets. And Tata Steel was set up more than 100 years back with this vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat. It was about Make in India, being self-sufficient in India, and leveraging the raw materials that is there in India to supply to the potential markets in India. The other reason why this industry is important for India's development is some of the richest parts of the country below the ground are the poorest parts of the country above the ground. Okay, so most of the minerals are in the eastern part of the country. You have states like Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, which has a lot of raw materials. But you know, obviously, the opportunity is to unlock the value of those raw materials below the ground and create value above the ground, create jobs above the ground. So that's another big reason why I think the industry is very important. The third reason is the steel industry creates jobs far away from the urban centers. You know, India's growth in the last maybe 10, 15 years has been driven by the services sector, which is largely urban India driven. Whereas if you look at steel industry, I mean, even if you look at a place like Jamshedpur, you created a city where there was nothing, right? I mean, you look at a new site in Kalinganagar, there was nothing there 10 years back. Today, there are 15 bank branches there, right? So to me, that kind of creates a more inclusive development. There are issues. You need to acquire land to build a steel plant. And if you don't do that well, you could have issues. But having said that, you're creating economic activity far away from the traditional urban centers. And I think particularly in the context of what we've seen over the last 3-4 months of migrant workers moving back from urban India to rural India, moving back to the states of the west and south and north to the states in the east, I think there needs to be more efforts made, more opportunities created for industries to come to these states, which are the source of migrant workers, so that migrant workers don't have to travel large distances to find jobs. So for multiple reasons, I think this is an industry which is important. It was important pre-COVID. It continues to be important, if not more important, post-COVID. The other thing is, of course, it's a capital-intensive industry. Tata Steel alone has invested in organic and inorganic growth. It's already spent maybe about $10 billion in the last 5-6 years, and is in the middle of another $3 billion project. So it's been one of the largest stories of private sector investment. The steel industry in India has been one of the largest stories of private sector investments in manufacturing over the last 10-15 years. And it spawns it spawns an ecosystem, because if you have a strong steel industry, you have the potential to create a strong capital goods industry. You have the potential to create a lot of downstream industries. So for multiple reasons, this is an industry which I think has a great opportunity for the future. Today, India is a 100 million ton producer and consumer of steel. Consumption is going to drop this year, but last year was about 100 million tons. That makes us the second largest in the world. But before we pat ourselves on the back, China is 8 times larger, 9 times larger, and they are the largest in the world. We've just overtaken Japan and the US, but the potential is huge. The Indian government has talked of the fact that they would like to see steel consumption or production at around 300 million tons in the next 10-15 years. And that's possible if the government spends on infrastructure that it plans to do, because infrastructure is very steel intensive. And if you look at the plan that the government has made about growing the consumption of steel, the biggest assumption is there will be a lot of infrastructure spend, and the consumption of steel in infrastructure sector will grow by 10 times in the next 10-15 years. So that's where the potential is of this industry. It's one of the best places to produce steel. The Indian steel producers, not just Tata Steel, even JSW and some of the others, are seen as some of the lowest cost producers of steel in the world. And I think, over the last 3 months, you will be surprised that most of the steel exported out of India has gone to China, because China's recovery post-COVID has been much sharper than we had anticipated. So China, which used to trouble us with a lot of exports of steel 3-4 years back, is today importing Indian steel, and Indian steel producers are making money at those prices. Because a few years back, there was a lot of discussion around the competitiveness of industry, and the steel industry was criticized for asking for support when China was dumping steel, and many people told us that we should learn to be competitive. But I think the fallacy with that argument is we confuse price and cost. You can call somebody competitive if they are able to sell at a certain price and make money at that price, right? If they're not able to make money at that price, I don't call them competitive. I call them cheap, right? Whereas the Indian steel industry had a cost structure which is lower than the prices at which the Chinese were selling. But the problem was with that kind of a price, the Indian steel industry was not making enough money to cover for the high cost of capital, to cover for the time taken to build a steel plant, to cover for all the costs outside the factory gate that we incur in India. Because you can be very competitive and world-class inside your factory gates, but if a lot of that competitiveness is eroded by your costs outside the factory gates, whether it's your tax rates, whether it's your cost of capital, whether it's your cost of logistics, or anything else, or the cost of time, because getting clearances takes time, then all that negates your competitiveness. So fundamentals, if you just look at the fundamentals, steel is an industry which can be world-class in India. It is a world-class scale. At 100 million tons, we are the second largest. We have some of the largest steel plants. Tata Steel itself is today the 10th or 9th largest producer of steel in the world. And there are many others who can be in that range, in the top 20, top 30. So India has world-class steel plants. It has world-scale steel plants. It's got competitive steel plants. Indian steel plants are, as far as the cost curve of the steel industry is concerned, at the right place. We are blessed with the raw materials. We are blessed with the growing market. So if there can be a success story for manufacturing in India, which is so important, and if there can be a success story of development in some of the poorer parts of the country, then I think the steel industry can play a very, very important role. And I think the government recognizes that. The government recognizes that the minerals and resource sector and the value-added sector of steel can really add value. But having said that, I think our pursuit of excellence, our pursuit of competitiveness, our pursuit of productivity, and I think areas which we need to do more work on is on technology. I think for an industry which has been around for a long time, I think we punch below our weighing class or whatever in technology. I think we need to have far more IP in the industry. We are still dependent on many foreign partners for technology. We need to have a very strong capital goods industry. China built a great capital goods industry to supply to the steel industry over the last 20 years. We need to do that as well. We need to also become digitally far more evolved. I think Tata Steel is in that journey for the last 3-4 years. We've been recognized by the World Economic Forum as one of the most advanced manufacturing companies in the use of digital, because it's a process industry. You generate a huge amount of data, and we only capture a fraction of that data today, and we only use a fraction of the data we capture. So there's a huge opportunity, whether it's in terms of running analytics or doing AI, using AI for safety, for process improvement, for many other things, or even the customer interface. There are so many things we can do. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that one can do in the industry. It leverages the fact that the process industry, which generates a lot of data. So to me, this industry needs to transform itself digitally. This industry needs to also leverage the fact that steel is one of the most recyclable materials in the world. It can be recycled in finite times. So if you look at a concept of a circular economy, steel is well placed for that. So the industry needs to grow sustainably. And this industry obviously needs to create value for its shareholders, which oftentimes it hasn't, because it's a cyclical industry with a lot of competition, which is supported by the state globally. And that kind of erodes the profitability of this industry. And it's gone through some bad cycles. So, if we are able to create more value for our shareholders, then I guess there will be a lot more interest from the investor community also in this industry beyond the traditional investors. So this is short snapshot of the industry. I'll be happy to elaborate on any of these or anything else as part of the Q&A.
Brilliant.
Wonderful.
In
Wonderful,
fact,
Narendran.
it's a wonderful snapshot. Himanshu, why don't you begin?
So I have two follow-up questions on what you said, Naren. The first follow-up question is on the infrastructure part. So with the growth of the infrastructure, the steel industry was also expected to grow in India. It didn't happen. Why was that? Was not enough money spent on the infra, or was it that money was being spent, it was imported steel which was getting used?
So the Indian steel industry has grown maybe from about 50 million tons to about 100 million tons. Okay, so it's grown, and like I said, it's today the second largest. Okay, but if you look at India's growth over the last 10, 15, 20 years, it's been more consumption-led growth than investment-led growth. Unlike China, which was more investment-led growth. Investment-led growth is more steel-intensive. Consumption-led growth is less steel-intensive, because in consumption-led growth, you're selling more cars and air conditioners and refrigerators, which use steel, but not as much as a bridge or something else, right? But I think the infrastructure spend of the government of India has really taken off in the last few years and is expected to take off in the next few years, right? So I think India is spending far more on infrastructure today than it did for a long time, okay? And so that kind of is leading to more consumption of steel. And even today, the infrastructure spend in India is, I think, maybe 3% or 4%, whereas it should be much higher, maybe 7, 8% or something like that. The infrastructure spend does two things for the industry. One is it's a driver of steel consumption. And that's why if you look at the national steel policy, when they say India will grow from 100 million to 300 million, the assumption is that the consumption of steel in infrastructure, which is today 10 million out of that 100 million, will go to 100 million out of 300 million. So from 10% of the steel consumption, it will become 30%. Right? So that's, to me, a very big assumption, and that depends on the government spending on infrastructure. The second reason why infrastructure spend is very important is a big part of our cost are the cost of not having infrastructure. Okay, the time we take to spend, we spend more shipping steel from Jamshedpur to Bombay than POSCO does from shipping steel from Korea to Bombay, right? So we spend a lot of time waiting for the vessels to unload in our ports or load in our ports. All these costs add up, you know, and so if there's more infrastructure spend, it adds to our efficiencies outside the factory gates.
Okay. So when it comes to the cost, so far as I remember, when I was there in Tata Steel, we were the lowest cost, I think, hot metal producer, if not the finished steel. We still continue to be, or, and if not, when did we lose that advantage?
No, we still are one of the lowest cost producers. We are in the top 3. Okay, I'll tell you why we are not the number 1. We are not the number 1 because the Russian ruble moved from 30 to $1 to 60 to $1, and overnight the dollar cost came down by half. So today the lowest cost producers of steel in the world are the Russians, because like us, they have the iron ore as well. So they have the same advantage that Tata Steel has of having iron ore, and the costs have come down in the last 5 years significantly just because of the ruble, right? So it's a touch and go between Tata Steel and some of the Russian producers. I'm proud to say that the India business is the most profitable steel business in the world. We are more profitable than the Russians if you look at the last quarters. You know, while there's a headline which says Tata Steel has declared a loss, if you look at the EBITDA margin for the India business, it's about 26% in Q4, and that's pretty much the highest even compared to the Russians, who are at maybe 22% EBITDA margins.
Fantastic. Now, I'm going to ask you to do a very difficult thing, and that is to put a soothsayer's hat and then make a prediction. Are we going to become the world's largest steel producer at some point of time? If yes, when?
I'm not so sure, and I don't think we need to be. Okay. I think if we want to have a sustainable industry which is profitable as well as sustainable from an environment point of view, I don't think we need to chase to be the biggest. We need to chase to be the best. We need to chase to be the most profitable and the most environmentally conscious and digitally advanced steel industry. And I think that we can do. And I think we have a good opportunity to do that. Because China is 8 times our size, 9 times our size. And if you look at it, China has also struggled. They grew too fast. And now they're closing a lot of steel capacity because they're very polluting. They're inefficient. I don't think we need to make the same mistakes. We need to build world-class steel capacity, steel plants who can compete with the best in the world, make the best products, make it the cleanest way, and gives back money to the shareholders better than anybody else in the industry.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Bhaskar.
Okay, I have a very unusual question. Since you deal with Russia, since you look at Russia, Russia has the advantage that India has of more coal, of iron ore, and of steel. But Russia does not have enough people. So Russia is looking at India providing some of the people to build the infrastructure. Tata Power is building the railway line and the coal mining plant somewhere in East Russia. Why doesn't Tata Steel do the same thing?
Well, I think we've not been able to fully capitalize on the opportunities in India. So if you ask me honestly,
Yes.
it took us a lot of time to start a second site in Kalinganagar. It took us 10 years. It took a lot of management effort. We've got a third site going because we acquired Bhushan Steel. So today, Tata Steel with these 3 sites in India is well positioned to go up to about 40 million tons of steel production just through these 3 sites, right?
Okay.
So when we look at our own business, we at one point in time, 70% of Tata Steel's business was outside India. Okay. Today, 60 to 70% is in India. So when you have a home market where you have so much potential, why wouldn't you leverage that as much as possible and then look at opportunities elsewhere? So that's the only thing. Secondly, Russia, from a steel point of view, is it's a great place to produce steel, but not a great place for steel consumption because they export 30 to 40% of the steel they produce because there's no domestic market.
There's no domestic market.
Yeah. So you wouldn't go to a country just to produce steel there and export. I'd rather produce in India and export out of India because the cost structure, like I said, is not so different. They have an advantage of the ruble for some time, but I think we can bridge that gap.
Okay. Lots of people have started sending in questions. One of the questions lots of questions relate to employment opportunities in the steel industry. You take apprentices, you train people, if it's a growing industry, you can keep on constantly employing people. What's your view?
Well, it's not necessarily so, right?
Okay.
I think Himanshu, if you ask Himanshu how many people were there in Tata Steel when he joined or when I joined,
76,000.
Correct. So today, Tata Steel in India is 10 times that size of steel production with half the number of people.
Exactly.
Okay. We are 15 times the size of raw material production when Himanshu was there, 10 times the size of steel production when Himanshu was there at less than half the people. And we are still reducing not because of anything else. We want to create more jobs, but we have to be competitive. See, how many industries are there in India which is capital intensive, which takes a huge amount of time to build, and you have to compete with zero import duty, right? So, and this industry has done that and survived. So it's a very tough industry, and to be able to survive, you need to be competitive. So, we create more jobs in the ecosystem. Like I said, Kalinganagar, 5 years back, there was nothing there, 6 years back. Today, we produce 3 million tons, going to expand to 8 million tons. Like I said, when I used to go there 5-6 years back, nothing there. Now there are 14 bank branches, right? So we've created now there may be only 3,000 people employed in the Kalinganagar steel plant because we need to only have that many to be competitive. But we've created thousands of jobs around the place.
Absolutely.
We've created a lot of activity. So I think the value of the industry is not the direct jobs that it creates. For every job we create in the industry, we create 7 to 8 jobs in and around the place.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that is the value of the industry.
Okay. Coming back to investments. Now, infrastructure requires investments.
Yeah.
The government has not been spending enough on infrastructure because there are many pressures on the government. And right now, it does not have the bandwidth to spend money. Ideally, then, private investment has to come in to build infrastructure, provided they're guaranteed that the investments are safe and provided they're guaranteed that they'll get a rate of return. Now, either they're not sure about that or they've not been welcome.
I think the government, so 2-3 things have happened, right? I think the government has, over the years, started spending more and more of their own money on infrastructure.
Yes.
Secondly, the government has experimented with private sector money coming into infrastructure, but for the reasons that you just described, the risk versus return has not played out, right? So today to attract private capital into that space is going to become very difficult. But having said that, I think the government is also doing a good job of trying to monetize a lot of assets it has, like it's doing with railways, right? I mean, looking at how can they make better use of railway lands, how can they monetize railway stations, and look at multiple ways in which you can build infrastructure. Again, if I take the example of railways, today we are one of the bigger private sector operators of rolling stock in the country because we are allowed to own rakes, because Tata Steel accounts for 4% of the freight revenue of Indian Railways, right? So we are a big user of the railways. Now, railways allows us to own rakes. Railways allows us to own wagons, so that we are not limited by railways' ability to deploy capital to build more rolling stock. We can, we have a subsidiary logistics company which does that. And so that's another way of getting private capital. So that company has spent money on rolling stock, which we use in the Tata Steel circuit, and obviously find some efficiencies. So I think there are many ways to do it. Ports, if you look at ports, Tata Steel built Dhamra port along with L&T many years back. Of course, Adani owns it now because running ports is not our business. We want someone to run ports efficiently for us, but if nobody is running it, we want to build one ourselves. But there is private capital coming into ports. So I think there is private capital coming into areas of infrastructure where there is some return, like you said. And we need to look at how do we make business case for private capital to come in. And there would be areas where the government needs to spend.
Okay. In this connection, let me ask you another question. One of the advantages you had in Jamshedpur was that you were protected by the constitution to create a city which politicians could not interfere with. Section 234Q. Will you enjoy the same advantages in your other townships that you are creating?
So the question is, do we need to? Because Jamshedpur has a lot of sentimental value to the Tata Group and Tata Steel. It's named after a founder. It is where it all began, right?
Yes.
So and there is a connect with the community which is been built over 100 years. It's part of the legacy of the group and what the group stands for. If you look at the history of Tata Steel and Tata Group, it was built as a township which had to be different from the industrial cities of England.
Yes.
The founder, J.N. Tata, and his son Dorab Tata saw that industrial England was full of squalor and terrible cities, right? So they wanted to build a city which was different. And that's why Jamshedpur, the concept of Jamshedpur, which had the best planners of that time come in from all over the world to design the place, is about having, a nice city, even though, so we have a 10 million ton steel plant in the middle of a city, but it's one of the greenest, cleanest cities that you can live in, right? So to me, but Tata Steel incurs a fair amount of cost to run that city. I agree with you. We have that freedom or space or whatever. But the question is, beyond Jamshedpur, do you really need to run a city with 15,000 acres of land and population, and 80-90% of the population are not, I would say even 90% of the population are not employees of Tata Steel, right? So do you want to take on that cost, to really run a steel plant? So if I look at Kalinganagar, right? In a 100-acre plot, we have created housing for, all our employees. And that's all you need to run. You don't need to run a 15,000-acre city to run a steel plant. And that's where, because when you ask steel industry to be competitive, then obviously we need to look at what are the costs only we can
trimming away the costs,
Yeah, and what are the costs which, let's say, the government should incur. And in a Kalinganagar context, I think the government is looking at creating shared infrastructure, which we are happy to participate in, and be part of. But do we really need to say that we'll run a city to run a steel plant? I'm not sure. 100 years back made sense. Today, may not.
Okay. Many people have asked me to ask you, where do you see dumping in this industry in the future? In the past, you had lots of problems with dumping. Now you're exporting to China. Do you expect dumping to become a problem once again? You have Korea on the sides. You have other players.
Yeah. So, dumping is a consequence of the steel cycle. Okay. In 2015, the steel industry never complained about steel coming into India and India had signed FTAs with Japan and Korea where the import duty is close to zero. And with China, the import duty was 5%. Like I said, there are very few capital intensive or any industry in India which is surviving at 0% duty and 5% import duty. Okay. So in 2015, when Chinese steel started coming into India at prices at which they were losing money, that's when the Indian steel industry made a lot of noise, right? So that's why I want people to understand the difference between price and cost. When you look at competitiveness, look at cost, don't look at price. Okay. So that is one point I want to make. The second point is all of us export at a price which tends to be lower than the price we get in our domestic markets. Okay. Japan exports steel at a far lower price than they get in the domestic market. Korea exports steel at a far lower price because only 10, 20, maybe in Japan and Korea, 30% of the steel is exported. China, 10% of the steel is was exported. India, so when you export, it is more to say that I've maximized what I can sell in the domestic market at decent prices. And now I need to sell another 10, 15% because I'm a high fixed cost industry. If I contribute to variable costs, I can ship it out.
Yes.
So as a consequence, any steel which goes into any market tends to be at a price which is at a disadvantage for the local producers. So when you look at anti-dumping is, I think in India, we are too defensive about dumping. Because we think that, oh, there's protection. I mean, the whole world does dumping. I mean, anytime you try and do something more into the US than they like, you are slammed with anti-dumping duties. So that's a way where you look at unfair practice. The WTO allows it. There is a process you follow. So I feel that sometimes in India, we are a bit too defensive about the subject. Because to me, if I look at Make in India, what is the most successful story of Make in India? It's auto industry, right? Now, do you think we would have had an auto industry if there was zero import duty for cars? We wouldn't have, right? But today, you have world-class auto industry, world-class auto component industry, because you opened it up for investments before you opened up for the products. Anybody who wanted to, what is the difference pre-1990 and post-1990? Pre-1990, there were only 2 or 3 car manufacturers. Post-1990, anybody who wanted to manufacture a car could come and invest in India and build a car plant. So the whole philosophy was build a car plant in India, invest in India, don't bring in cars from all over the place, create that ecosystem and build world-class facilities. And today we have a world-class auto industry. So our position as steel industry is let anyone come and invest in India, build steel in India. India allows you to own 100% iron ore, which very few countries allow. Use the competitive factors of India, create jobs in India, make steel in India, sell in India, and export out of India. I think that should be the philosophy rather than say, hey, I have some extra steel, let me dump it in your country or sell it in your country at prices at which I don't make money.
Point taken.
Bhaskar, I have a follow-up question here.
Okay.
Because, I'm also going down the memory lane.
Absolutely.
I'm trying to remember my good old Tata Steel days. And even today, I say that my company, I use the word my company when I talk about Tata Steel.
Yes.
And I still remember, Naren, we had so many problems with Gopalpur when we were trying to acquire land over there. So in these 20 years, how have things changed? Have they become better? Have they become more difficult when it comes to acquisition of land, particularly when it comes to greenfield projects? Because if we want to expand big time, we will have to set up greenfield projects.
Yes.
Yeah. No, it's a big issue in India, and I think we should recognize that. As you said, at that point in time, we acquired land in Gopalpur. Then we realized that there were some factors which did not favor building a steel plant there. So today we still have that land. We are trying to invest in other industries and get other investors in, and we've been reasonably successful over the last couple of years. But we chose an alternate site in Odisha, which is Kalinganagar, right? Even there, we had a problem. We had a huge problem when we went to acquire land. I think one of the learnings for Tata Steel from that experience is obviously acquiring land in India. In an ideal world, the government acquires, gives you the land, and you move in and build whatever you want. If that happens, perfect. Doesn't happen, right? Now, when that doesn't happen, I think what we've learned from the Kalinganagar experience is just because we built trust in Jamshedpur, just because the communities accepted us in Jamshedpur, we cannot assume that you go to another place, the communities will accept you. So you need to build trust before you build walls. And I think, so if tomorrow you want to start a new greenfield site, I think we would, even before we start constructing anything, you would send your teams there, start building bridges with the community, start building trust with them, do the CSR that we do very effectively with them, get them to trust you, get them to engage with you, you engage with them, then you build the steel plant. So it's a longer process. But I don't think there are shortcuts in this unless the government steps in and gives you land to use. Hence, when Bhushan Steel as an opportunity came up, we picked it up because we said it took us 10 years to build Kalinganagar. Today, Bhushan Steel produces more than Kalinganagar, right?
Yes.
We acquired it 2 years back. Okay, we ramped up from 3 million tons to 5 million tons with hardly any capex. So if I look at it from an NPV point of view, you put in the money. Yeah, whereas for Kalinganagar, for 10 years, we were spending money before we started earning any money, right?
Yes.
So you have to start looking at the time value of money when you start valuing assets and then take those calls. So today with these three big sites, between Bhushan Steel, which is in Angul, Kalinganagar and Jamshedpur, like I said, we have the land that is required to build up to 40 million tons of steel capacity in India, which is double what we are today. And I think which is good enough for the next 10 years.
Okay. You talked to automobiles. Okay.
Yeah.
Himanshu, can you take this up?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. You talk to automobiles. The automobile sector is going through a disruption. The current automobile is very heavy. With the electric vehicle, you're going to have composites. You're going to have less steel, lighter vehicles moving faster. Same thing with self-driven vehicles. Will that change the profile of the steel industry? And how are you getting prepared for this new change?
Sure. So 2-3 things, right? So one is, even if you look at the cars of today, the traditional cars of today, they use maybe 50% of the steel that was used 15 years back.
Point. Yes.
80 to 90% of the steels which are used in cars today, at least in Europe and other places, didn't exist in 15 years back. So the steel industry and the auto industry have constantly produced higher tensile steels, thinner steels, stronger steels, more formable steels. Okay, so that journey continues. And the World Steel Association, which all of us are a part of, is working on what is called the future steel vehicle, which is basically developing very high-end steels for the automotive of the future. Having said that, obviously in a electric vehicle, the impact of lighter steels or lightweighting the vehicles is that much more important because you're eating up into the weight of a battery, which eats up into the driving range of the car, right? So obviously the race has become a bit tougher. From a Tata Steel point of view, while we are on that journey of developing stronger steels, lighter steels, and the Kalinganagar plant is actually in that direction, we've also developed a new materials business. So we are into composites, we are into fiber reinforced polymers.
Wow.
So we have a separate vertical. My meeting just before this was on that.
Okay? Oh, wow.
So there are businesses which we are starting, which will also address that. So, we are into new materials and very advanced materials, and that business is starting to grow, and there's a lot of work going on there. So there'll be some exciting stuff there also.
One more question. India, for the last 3 years, last 10 years, has been talking about defense production in India, make in India. Now, defense is a big consumer of steel.
Yeah.
Where do you see the defense industry contributing to your demand?
As of now, it's very, very small because there's hardly any defense production in India. Okay. So when I look at, I think less than 2% of the steel consumed in India goes for defense production. Okay.
Ouch.
But having said that, I think the number I read somewhere was India imports $500 billion worth of defense, right?
Yes.
So what the industry is chasing, not us, but the people who are in that space, are at least $100 billion of that should be produced in India. Okay. When we reach that scale, then of course defense becomes an important consumer of steel. But till that happens, because just now there is hardly any manufacturing happening. So I see it at least 5-10 years away, because I think even today the private sector is struggling with the whole process of defense procurement, the kind of approvals that they need. And there are many of our customers like Bharat Forge, for instance, who are, very actively looking at this space, L&T, Bharat Forge, etc. So I think as they create those manufacturing facilities, we are confident we can leverage.
But you think that's 5 years ahead, 5 years away?
5 to 10 years. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
It's at least 10 years away for it to be bigger than construction. It can never be bigger. Construction will always be 50-60% of steel consumption. Auto industry will be 10-15%, capital goods another 10%. So it's going to be the fourth of its largest consumer maybe 10 years from now.
Okay, let me take a question from Himanshu.
Okay.
Say once again,
Yeah.
and try to tell me, what do you think is going to happen in the next 1 year to the steel industry? I'm not talking Tata Steel, the steel industry, because we've gone through harrowing times in the last 1 year.
So I think, no, are you talking the next 1 year? What's
Next
going to
1 year,
happen?
because this is a crisis year.
Absolutely. So we are forecasting the consumption of steel will drop by 15 to 20% this year. Okay.
Ouch,
Wow.
that bad.
So from about 100 million tons of consumption, it'll come to maybe about 85. Okay. But we are also forecasting exports to go up. Okay.
Okay.
So this could be the first year when India exports more than 10 million tons of steel. Okay.
Okay.
So the industry is pivoting quite well into the export markets. Tata Steel traditionally exports about 10-15% of its production. This quarter, we finished at 50% exports. Next quarter, as the domestic market picks up, we will be at 30% exports. And that's true of all the other players. So I think the Indian steel industry will demonstrate to the world that it can export profitably. It can be a competitive industry.
Excellent.
And so it kind of builds that confidence. So tomorrow, when the domestic demand comes back, I'm sure Indian producers will plan capacity expansions to cater to the export markets.
Himanshu, do you want to ask a question or do I go ahead?
Yeah. No, I mean, I just wanted a follow-up question, when he said that.
I could see that in your eyes.
that Indian steel industry will tell the rest of the world that we can produce profitably and export as well. Naren, you remember, everyone in Tata Steel knows this story that 100 years back, aspersions were cast by the British about the quality of steel
India would produce.
produces.
Yes.
Tata Steel was the one who showed them that we can produce quality steel in this country of ours.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
I think the time has come again for us to actually show to the rest of the world that Tata Steel and Indian steel industry can actually produce quality steel for the rest of the world as well. So I just thought I would make that comment.
Absolutely. Okay. I think for those of your listeners who don't know, the name Jamshedpur came about because the British were grateful to Tata Steel for supplying steel in the Middle East during World War I, for the rails and for many other things that were important for the battles in Mesopotamia. And hence the name Sachi was changed to Jamshedpur as a measure of gratitude to Tata Steel. So I think we got endorsement very quickly after all the initial criticism.
Okay. Can I go back once more to the investment question?
Sure.
The railways is a large user of steel. But ask any technical expert in the railways, almost all the railway tracks need to be replaced. They're very old to the point of becoming dangerous. So the potential for investment is tremendous, provided someone comes in to take the risk or the government spends. Is it possible? I'm just asking a wild question. Is it possible Tata Steel to sit in the government and create a financing agency with an escrow account where the railways puts in the money and make sure that the investor gets the money? Because if your guarantees are there, investments will come in.
Are you talking of investments in railways or investments in
investments in steel?
No, so let me put it this way. There are two types of steel used in railways. One is the rolling stock.
Okay.
Right? For the rolling stock, we make the steel. I think India makes the steel already. In terms of rails, there are two types of rails. There's the rails that you see for the regular trains, which is made by SAIL. Steel Authority makes it, and JSPL also makes it. Okay.
Okay.
There's enough made. And earlier it was only SAIL, now JSPL also makes it. Then there is railways for the high-speed rails. Okay. That is traditionally not been made in India. I'm not sure if JSPL can make it yet or SAIL can make it yet. But that Tata Steel in Europe used to make it. In fact, Tata Steel, we sold that business a couple of years back, but Tata Steel in Europe was a supplier of those high-speed rails to Chennai Metro and to Hyderabad Metro.
Okay.
So otherwise, those rails, are high tensile rails, are high-speed rails, were imported. The problem with the railways business is that there are few manufacturers of rails in the world, and they have a lot of excess capacity. So it's not an economically strong proposal, and that's why there are very few people So you run the risk of having one customer oftentimes, which is the railways. So, I would be very wary about getting into a business where I have only one customer,
Which is
because
true.
you're very vulnerable, particularly capital intensive industry. And secondly, there's a lot of capacity around in the world. So from Europe, people would export rails into India. So unless you say that I will only buy rails made in India, which I think today SAIL and JSPL make, uh, then the existing players can make those rails. So to me, everyone doesn't need to make everything, but I think whatever we do, we need to be the best at it.
Excellent. Um, in a way, you've answered most of the questions, and there are many more, but they can go on and on and on. And I know that time's running out. So thank you for giving us such a marvelous bird's eye view of the steel industry. Himanshu, will you do the formal thanks and the closure?
Thank you, Mr.
I mean,
Bhaskar.
much as I hate to do it, but I think we have to bring it to a close. And we had asked Narendran, and we have taken a lot of time from Naren. But I just want to highlight a few things for all our viewers. I know that you would have several other questions. So I just put in one more question to you, Naren, before I actually post this. And this has got nothing to do with the steel industry. This comes from a personal experience. While I was back then, you were adored by everyone. Even when I talk to people today, everyone says very, very good things about you, particularly about the fact that you are one of the most humble people that they have ever met. And Tatas have always stood for those kind of values. One of the values that I have imbibed is what J.N. Tata said: what is good for India is good for the Tatas. And subsequently, we have just followed that. And humility was one of the core values that everybody in the Tatas has always spoken about. Do you think humility is still relevant in the cutthroat, competitive world of today? Can humility and leadership go together? Just a quick one, because many of our audience are young audience and they actually want to listen to you.
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, firstly, thank you for all those compliments. I think, I mean, personally, it's your personal value system, right? I mean, the good thing about Tata Steel or the Tata Group is you have a personal value system which is congruent with the group's value system. You're perfectly made for each other. To me, it's about authenticity, which is to me more important. And if you're authentic and real, then you will be humble. Because all of us are what we are. I mean, the position that I have is transient, right? I mean, I'm not going to have it forever. One fine day I'll be out of this and being Naren, right? I mean, it doesn't matter what positions I had or designations I had. So to me, it's just about being yourself. You know that all these things are transient. You enjoy it while it is there. Don't take yourself more seriously than you need to. I think be there. Once I heard Mr. Deepak Jain, who used to be the dean of Kellogg's, and at one point in time, I was in some program in Indian School of Business, and he was supposed to be the first dean of Indian School of Business in the late 90s. So he said something which his guru or somebody had told him, which I thought was very powerful. He said, when the shadow is bigger than the man, the sun is going to set. I said, that's fantastic. So I said, okay, I keep,
very true.
repeating that. So it's good to have the shadow at your level and not make it any bigger than you actually are. Yeah.
But thank you. That's an insight. That's amazing.
Thank you very much, Naren. Thank you very much for that insight, and thank you very much for taking us through the entire steel industry nitty-gritties and also what lies in the future ahead for all of us. For me personally, takeaway, and I have made a note of it, and of course I'm going to quote you. You can rest assured is that build trust before you build walls. I mean, that's such a powerful quote. You first need to actually build those bridges with people before you actually start building a brick and a mortar business. So it was such a pleasure to have you with us, Naren.
Amazing.
And for those of you who don't know Naren personally, by the way, he's an accomplished percussionist, plays the drums, avid dog lover. In fact, just before we started, we were both exchanging notes as pet daddies. And we were talking about our pet babies. And as they say,
I've got four
if
dogs
a man
in a
loves
house.
a dog, he's a good man. And if a dog loves a man, he's even a a better man, and also a person who not only reads as much as I do. He may not have the books right now behind him like I do. But
it's under the iPad to raise the height of the iPad.
And then, more importantly, also believes in keeping himself fit. And I know it as a matter of fact that he tries to run most of the 10-kilometer runs that he possibly can.
Absolutely. That's all I can do. I can't do anything more than that. So I limit myself to 10 kilometers.
That's a lot. That's a lot. So thank you very much for teaching us this valuable lesson on humility, on authenticity, and taking us through this beautiful journey of Tata Steel. I'm sure that all the viewers out there would have lots of other questions as well. We're going to take those questions later and possibly bother you once again.
Sure.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you very much to all our viewers. Please stay home. And if you're working, if you're going out, please stay safe, please stay healthy, and take very good care of yourself and your families, and particularly of those who are not in a position of advantage as much as you are.
And most important, thank you, Himanshu. Thank you, Naren, for making this possible. This is the last fun event in this series.
Oh, yes.
Other series also coming up very soon.
And by the way, Naren, before I close, another thing that some of our viewers obviously would have noticed this, Naren also happens to be the name of another person who was very, very humble and who showed India the way. And I'm talking about Swami Vivekananda. I think, although Bhaskar pointed out that this journey of ours, I Am Indore and Free Press Journal is coming to an end so far as this particular series is concerned, I would like to quote Vivekananda and say, Charai Vaiti, Charai Vaiti. We will continue to walk and we will continue to walk.
And I hope we'll interact more often.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on the show. Thank you, Bhaskar.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.